Well, as the first speaker in the morning, my job is to wake you up. If your coffee doesn't do the job, my talk, I think, should be controversial enough to do it. I make the case in Alberta for phasing out the sands. I'm glad I'm not giving this to the Petroleum Club in Calgary. The only thing I ask is don't rush to judgment. I call them, some call them the oil sands, others the tar sands. I just take a neutral term, the sands. Resources and people are the themes of this year's conference. What natural resource and which people are most important to Alberta? For a natural resource, many would pick oil. When the price is right, the economy thrives. When it's wrong, it dives. Boom and bust. But is oil really Alberta's most important resource? No, it's water, the source of life and food. Now, agrologists understand the primacy of water over oil. Oil's time will pass, but people will continue to live and thrive in this beautiful province and country long after oil. What about people? Most Albertans have the education to go beyond the simple economy of our foreparents as hewers of wood, growers of grain, and diggers of oil. Albertans are skilled, educated, and innovative enough to thrive in the low-carbon future. How many will embrace it? One Albertan who looked deeply into the future was Peter Lougheed. As Premier, he planned for the day Alberta would no longer rely on oil. His government doubled oil and gas royalties, one of the first things he did, because they're non-renewable. That wealth would not last. Under Lougheed's leadership, Alberta created one of the world's first petroleum savings funds, the Heritage Fund, into which his government put 30% of the higher royalties. The visionary idea was to save today's windfall wealth to fund tomorrow's provincial economy beyond oil. That was 2 decades. So the Heritage Fund was created 2 decades before Norway started its petroleum fund. Unfortunately, the Conservative premiers who followed Lougheed lowered royalties and stopped putting any into the Heritage Fund. It's now worth $19 billion Canadian. Meanwhile, Norway started 20 years later, and they have 1.2 trillion in Canadian dollars, 62 times as much, and they have about as much oil and gas as Alberta does. What could Alberta have done in the past 3 years if the Heritage Fund had had that much? Well, after retiring, Lougheed still thought ahead. I can imagine an Alberta without oil, he wrote in 2005, but not without water. Well, my green paper outlines the case for Alberta and Canada to phase out the sands by 2040. A council appointed by former Premier Ed Stelmach warned that, and I quote, "Oil sands production will almost certainly be displaced at some point in the future by lower cost and/or lower emission alternatives. We can choose to wait until circumstances change and then react as best we can, or we can be proactive, making strategic investments to shape the Alberta we want. In other words, act or be acted upon." Will a low international oil price phase out the sands, or do we need government to ensure it happens by 2040? I will be addressing that question. Well, phasing out the sands is very challenging, so my report looks at ending coal-fired electricity in Ontario and Alberta for lessons on a managed transition of the sands. I make the case this morning without most of the supporting numbers. They're in my green paper. And it's also good to have David Hughes follow me the next talk. He's one of Canada's leading geoscientists. I rely on his numbers to, among other things, show that Alberta and Canada can't have their cake and eat it too. We can't build new oil and gas pipeline capacity and let sands emissions grow by 50% in the next 12 years and still meet Canada's climate promises made in Paris. Remember when Justin Trudeau proclaimed in Paris that Canada is back. Calgary's oil patch reassures us that emissions from the sands are minuscule. Phasing them out would do almost nothing for the climate, but it would kill Alberta's golden goose. That spin is wrong, but is enticing for those who want to believe in business as usual. Now think of two lines going in opposite slopes. Canada's total emissions dropping by 80% by 2050 from 1990 levels. And that's what we promised at the G8, and all the G8 countries have promised. At the same time, the sands is going up, going to grow by almost 50% over the next, that's what the Alberta cap allows it to do. So, and if those two lines keep going like that, by 2050, the sands, emissions from the sands will take 80% of Canada's total emissions, and there won't be room for anything else. The sands are Canada's largest single emission source, and it's the fastest growing one, rising more than fourfold since 1990. Alberta has 12% of Canada's population, but accounts for 37% of its greenhouse gases. The astonishing impact of the sands and other carbon fuel in Alberta can be seen in the following comparison. With 4.2 million people, Alberta produces 8% more emissions than Ontario and Quebec combined, and those two provinces have 22 million people. And it isn't because of Alberta's driving habits. Transportation accounts for only 11% of Alberta's emissions. So if you look at economic sectors, at the bottom there, the green quadrant there, that's transportation. But up on the top right, that is emissions from oil and gas. It is the biggest emissions. I didn't have an information graphic, the most recent one, but in 2016, that has grown to 192 megatons. It is still growing, and it is going to take more and more of that whole pie. So here is what has happened to emissions. If you look on the left here, in 1990, Alberta had 28% of Canada's emissions. They're at 36%. And you can see that the big populous provinces of Ontario is down, and so is Quebec. So those keep growing. So here is the growth since 1990. So we go back to 1990 as the level for our emissions that they're supposed to be reduced from. You can see that Saskatchewan has grown by 66%, Alberta by 53%. BC and Manitoba have grown a little bit, but all of the eastern provinces' emissions have dropped. And so it's mainly from the oil and gas production that you get those great emissions differences. Alberta's emissions are six times as high as in Ontario and Quebec, for example. Well, we keep hearing that Canada's minuscule emissions, and it doesn't matter what we do. It's not true. Canada is the 38th country in population in the world and 9th in emissions. We're in the top 10 in emissions. So with 0.5% of the world's population, we produce 1.6% of the world's emissions. That is 3 times the per capita global level. Do Canadians have special dispensation to foul humanity's common atmosphere at that level? So if you look at, this is annual emissions. What you can see is these are Canada's emissions here, and this is our percentage of the population. You can see that that is a much narrower group. So we're in the top 10, but we're even though we don't have a big population. The growing negative impacts of global warming are increasingly impelling countries to curb carbon emissions. The momentum is building and won't be stopped by temporary setbacks such as Trump's presidency. By 2050, the age of oil will likely be over, no longer the world's dominant energy source around which military strategies are shaped and wars fought. That doesn't mean all oil use will cease. Radio didn't disappear when television and the internet pushed aside its dominance. Radio is still with us, but gone are the days when everyone huddled around the family's sole radio. Oil's fate will be similar. Oil will continue to be produced and used, especially to make things like plastics, but at a much lower level. And renewable energy and conservation, deep conservation, will dominate. If global demand for oil falls a lot by mid-century, where will the smaller supplies come from? Will it be from low-cost, low-carbon intense conventional oil that will still be plentiful in the Middle East, or from high-cost, carbon-intense sources, including Alberta sands? The answer is obvious. Long-term prognosis for Alberta's sands are poor. Their prospects depend on a high world price and sufficient buyers outside Alberta willing to overlook their irreducibly higher carbon emissions from their production. That combination is unlikely. Environment Canada says that the sands carbon intensity is not improving. They're as bad as they were in 2005. There are technical improvements but they're entirely being negated by the shift from surface mining to deeper, more energy-intensive extraction, SAGD, steam-assisted gravity drainage, and by declining reservoir quality. As you can expect, the oil companies went to the best spots first, so the low-hanging fruit got picked first. Oil industry spin doctors like to make wells to wheels comparisons to show that the production of sands oil is not that much more carbon intense than conventional oil. It's a stunt. If you can't improve the numerator, that's the emissions from the sands, why don't you just expand the denominator a lot by throwing in irrelevant things like emissions from vehicles burning oil as gasoline? That mathematical game doesn't reduce the carbon emissions gap between sands oil and conventional oil and won't help the climate. At a news conference in Edmonton in March 2006, Hugh McCullum and I called for a 5-year moratorium on new sands projects. The news conference was launched McCullum's report, Fueling Fortress America. I was there as the head of Parkland Institute, the report's co-publisher. Our moratorium call was quickly joined by First Nations, the Alberta Federation of Labour, many of Canada's main churches, environmental groups, and the Alberta NDP, which at that point was an opposition party. Prominent individuals included Peter Lougheed, Fort McMurray Mayor Melissa Blake, and prominent water scientist David Schindler. The calls range from a complete halt pending Indigenous, environmental, economic, social, health, and community impacts to slowing the impact of development. For some, Alberta sands have become better known internationally since 2006 as a poster child for all that is wrong with big oil producing the Earth's dirtiest oil. The sands phase-out call is even more urgent now than it was in 2006. The sands have 97% of Canada's total oil reserves and make Canada holder of the 3rd largest proven oil reserves in the world. Can we still keep the world within the Paris climate target of 2 degrees, not rising more than 2 degrees from pre-industrial levels, if we extract and burn all of those sands, the viable reserves? Many climate scientists think not. Justin Trudeau acknowledged this. You can't make a choice between what's good for the environment and what's good for the economy. He said, we can't shut down the oil sands tomorrow. We need to phase them out. That is going to take time. Well, 6 years before the Paris Climate Accord of 2015, all G8 countries committed to cut their greenhouse gases by 80% below their 1990 level by 2050. And Prime Minister Harper agreed to that. To meet its G8 promise, Canada's annual emissions must fall from 613 megaton level to 123 megatons by 2015. So remember that 123, because it's only 23 megatons above the emissions cap for Alberta sands. So if you have the sands at 100 megatons and you have Canada going down to 123, so you can see, we won't be able to do other things like drive to work or heat our homes. In Paris, 195 countries agreed to keep the world below that 2-degree rise. It was historic because China and the US, the world's two greatest carbon polluters, agreed for the first time to cut greenhouse gases considerably. So strong immediate action is needed to limit that the world to that 2-degree rise, because we've already risen by 1.2 degrees. Most climate scientists predict that runaway global warming will occur above a 2-degree rise as natural feedbacks kick in. When the targets of all the countries they submitted to the Paris talks are combined, the global temperature will rise between 2.6 degrees and 3.1 Celsius, so it's not enough. So Paris was strong on aspirations, but very weak on delivery. Each country has to find its own unique roadmap. Canada now has a federal provincial one, the Pan-Canadian Framework on Climate, decided in December. It will put a price on carbon through carbon taxes or cap and trade, depending on province. The carbon price will rise to $50 a ton by 2022 and add 11 cents a liter at the pumps. Coal-fired electricity will be phased out across Canada by 2030. Other measures include electrical transmission lines between provinces, new building codes, rising vehicle efficiency standards, electrical vehicle infrastructure, and reducing methane emissions. Canada's targets are much lower than the European Union's and the US. So we are actually saying we are going to reduce emissions by 2030 by only 1.7% a year. The US and the UE say we're doing it by 2.8% per year. Will adding 11 cents a liter, they're going to take 6 years to add 11 cents a liter at the pumps. Well, if you go back 2.5, 3 years ago, before the world price of oil crashed, they were 20 to 40 cents a liter higher than they are now. And what did that do to curb carbon emissions? Almost nothing. That main plank in Canada's plan is very weak. Alberta's climate plan was included in the Pan-Canadian Framework. It's the elephant in the room. Alberta's plan will curb some emissions, but not reduce them overall. It includes a broad-based carbon tax that started this January, reducing methane emissions by 45% and closing all coal-powered generating units by 2030. What's the problem? Well, all those measures will be entirely negated by enabling sands emissions to grow from 68 megatons to 100 megatons in the next 12 and a half years. That's a 47% increase. Alberta's Climate Leadership Plan, as it's called, will likely prevent Canada from reaching its Paris climate promises.